AgriSA says government should be focusing on agrarian reform in South Africa rather than trying to amend Section 25 of the Constitution. It's presented its solutions to the slow pace of land reform. And one of them, it says, is the creation of an Agri development fund to speed up transformation and create more jobs. Well, AgriSA's head of corporate affairs, Pietman Roos, joins us now from our Pretoria studios. Good evening, Mr. Roos. Thank you very much for talking to us. Before I get to your proposal, I just want to ask something that caught my eye from the statement that AgriSA issued today. Now, you'll recall that last year you got yourselves into hot water by coming up with unbelievable numbers that some people said were inflated on how land reform has progressed. Now, today you are claiming that during 2017, you and your affiliate spent 331 million on transformation, and 108 and 307 new farmers benefited from these programs. Why should we believe you?
Okay, so hi Vu and welcome. Thanks for having me. So the figure of 313 million is the figure that AgriSA, through its affiliates, has spent on transformation within agriculture in the past financial year. Those projects included skills training and upliftment, and we work very closely through commodity organizations to effect that. It's only a single year that money was spent, but it takes several years really to train a farmer. But we're quite excited. There's 108,000 beneficiaries, many of them who are farmers, who's part of that broader project. Keep in mind that it's several organizations who were also part of that, but they're within the AgriSA fold.
Well, of course, I mean, you know, and this is something you too, AgriSA, that is said in your last report, that the lack of accurate and reliable numbers is distorting the conversation around land reform. So who can independently vouch for those numbers?
Well, I think it's necessary to have some idea of what the true extent of land ownership is, and we took a stab at it. We did get a professional firm to come and help us, but we are in no way suggesting that what we're putting on the table is the alpha and omega. But it is necessary to at least have a sense of where the ownership is. And of course, we welcome government and other interested parties to enter the debate. It's not where the debate should end, but of course, if you know more or less where the ownership is, you can plan a bit better. And if you bring in policies, you need a base from where to measure whether there has been any successes in transformation, of course.
Now, you are proposing the setting up of an Agri development fund, which you say will not only accelerate transformation, but create 1 million jobs, as well as 10,000 new black commercial farmers. How is this going to work?
So I think in essence, the problem that we've seen is that it is difficult to get finance for agriculture, for transformation, but at the same time, very strangely, that there are a number of financial organizations, local and international, commercial and developmental, who urgently wants to enter agricultural development. So our proposal in very broad terms is to bring all of them together into one organization, right? To create a vehicle where a commercial bank can come in, someone like the IFC can come in, World Bank maybe can come in, and government as well. What we've seen is the cost of capital is very high when it comes to transformation and when it comes to investment into agriculture, and that manifests in high interest rates. So because the interest rate is high, it's also difficult to repay it, so the project is stopped even before it can begin. And this kind of reasoning applies whether it's farming, whether it's, regardless of your industry, you need to keep your cost of capital as low as possible. So our suggestion is broad, is the more funders we can bring into a single pool, the more we can spread the risk. And of course, developmental international funds like the World Bank and the IFC take different views on payback. So they might say, look, we're more lenient on the payback of the interest. We can take a longer term view, maybe take a few decades for the payback of the loan, whereas commercial banks can come in quickly and put money in, but they would like to see at least something comparable to commercial rates of return. Another element to this funding is that when it comes to large, getting a lot of money into a pool and starting to fund, and this is especially true for private equity, is that the funds don't want to mess around with any investment below 100 million. Right? So because it doesn't really make sense for them, they have to do due diligence, they have to appoint auditors and accountants and all those guys. So you also need someone on the ground to help spread this billions of rands that you will want to get into this fund. So we see a role there, at least in facilitating and advising. But in essence, our suggestion is to bring a lot of role players into the same fund and exploring what can be done. We've had discussions with several international funding agencies, and they would go so far as to say they will take the first loss if there's a problem in not repayment of certain of the loans. But I mean, it gets rather technical in how you structure a fund like that. But in essence, the more people you get in, the more different types of repayment schedules you can work in, the more money you can put towards agrarian reform. So yes, it is an aggressive target to create that amount of jobs, but I think let's be aggressive about this because it's a national priority.
Pardon me if I'm too slow to understand this. If you are saying, or by your own admission, this in essence, or this agri-development fund you're talking about, is essentially a pulling together of what already exists, how then is it new and innovative, and how is it going to create 1 million jobs and 10,000 new black commercial farmers if all it is, from what you've just explained, is really pulling together under one roof everything that already exists?
So, okay, so sorry, I'm not hearing perfectly, but your question is the funds are there already. What's the difference? How are we going to change anything? Well, the funds are there, but they're operating largely in silos, and they're not getting to the farmers. I think that's the big point. So by pulling them together, you also create an economies of scale. And by doing that, it becomes cheaper to give funding to emerging farmers. And again, if you have developmental agencies and governments who put money in, all of a sudden it makes more sense for commercial financiers to enter this fund as well. Whereas without a vehicle like this, they would be holding back and be applying very hard commercial conditions to any loan agreements.
Okay, that's where we're going to leave it. Thank you very much for talking to us this evening. Pietman Roos is the head of corporate affairs at AgriSA. He reckons they have an innovative idea of an agri-development fund that they say will not only accelerate transformation, but create 1 million jobs as well as 10,000 new black commercial farmers.